I have former U.S. Senator Tom Coburn right here in the New York studio. Senator Coburn, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Speak a little closer into the mic.
Right.
I want to make sure people get every syllable. You, sir, are complicated to describe, which is a compliment. First of all, you have a brand new book out called Smashing the D.C. Monopoly. I like the verb smashing because the monopoly needs smashing. It's a satanic, ugly thing. You, at the bottom, the subtitle of this new book, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, the subtitle is Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop Runaway Government. I think tons of Americans, almost all of whom elected Donald Trump to be our president, understand something is wrong and the politicians have not fixed it. It's why they elected somebody from outside the system and are eager to see him do things differently. You were a senator for 10 years. You reminded me that I met you 5 years ago when I spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast in 2012, that you were there. You said that you left the Senate because things weren't changing. You went there to do the people's bidding, and you found that you were frustrated. Is that, I assume that's why you wrote this book, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly?
Well, that's partly correct. Actually, I left because I didn't think we can fix it there, and I still don't. If you think about what happens to people who actually go there well intended, and all of a sudden their motivations change to stay there, it's pretty hard to get people to make the hard decisions that are necessary for our country.
Now, how does that happen? In other words, how do good people go there and then their motivation changes to I want to hang on to power? What is that?
Because it's an elixir. Being powerful, having lots of ability to tell other people what to do and how to do it, and actually what we know through history and we know through human behavior that even though power corrupts, but what really happens is it breeds arrogance, and arrogance leads to poor judgment, and so. I'm an idealist. I have a business background. I practiced medicine for 25 years, delivered over 4,000 babies.
What?
Delivered over 4,000 babies.
4,000 babies. That is a number. I think you beat Pete Rose. I think he was only 3,000 and something.
Well, I didn't gamble on mine. But the point is my experience. I actually believed what the founder said.
Yeah.
And to my chagrin, when I got there, I found that, often that's the last thing that's thought of in Washington.
Well, see, again, it's one of the reasons I want to have you on here because as we were talking about earlier, I wrote a book, If You Can Keep It, and I thought all of the stuff that I put in that book is stuff that I did not learn growing up. If you grew up in the 70s, the 80s, whatever, we passed a time where we were passing this on to our kids, and you cannot have an America if Americans don't understand this stuff. In other words, if you do not understand what the founders created and gave us to keep, in Franklin's famous verb, then it just naturally goes away. And I really do believe we're living in a time where it is going away, which is why I wrote the book and why I want to talk to people like you, that if we don't get drastic, the car is headed over the cliff. We're not there yet, but we're going over unless we do something.
Well, I think, and adding to your concern is over a third of America's never seen America when it's great, when it has a positive outlook, when it has an I can do, when we have growth of 3 or 4%. The last time we saw that was under Reagan. And, if you look at the millennials, they certainly don't remember. They don't even know who Reagan was.
It's hard for me to believe because I think in my mind I'm a lot younger than I actually am. And I think of myself as, a kid, and I think of Reagan as 10 minutes ago. And then you realize, well, no, Eric, if you look at the math, what you're saying is correct. There are a lot of people that have not seen that. Yeah. They were under Bill Clinton's presidency, which was sordid, and then of course we had the Iraq invasion, and we had a lot of things happen, and then we had 8 years, which is a very long time, of a president who I think if he had tried hard to undermine the founders, he could not have done better than he did. I don't know whether he was trying hard or he just lucked into it, but he seems to have destroyed much of what the founders had put into place.
Well, his philosophy, he told us he wanted to change America, and that was his goal. And his philosophy is different than our founders were. It's a social justice-centered philosophy that isn't on the basis of liberty and freedom and free economic freedom,
right,
and self-reliance and hard work and reward for effort for excellence. I mean, we put all that away, and
right,
then we say, you get a participation trophy if you come out.
Yeah.
And so there's no recognition of excellence.
That's not the way the West was won.
Well, it's also not the way you have economic progress.
Well, that's a fact.
Yeah.
But I'm saying anything that we didn't defeat the Nazis that way. What made us a great nation never partook of that kind of thinking. That kind of thinking is a defeatist European socialist view of the world, which ironically doesn't even work for them, and it's not working for them now.
Well, it started for us actually with a court case in 1931, but it actually moved forward with the Great Society.
Yes.
When the actual poverty rate was 19.2%, it's 19.8% now with 110 million more people. And $37 trillion later, and we've undermined self-reliance to a large segment of our society who's now dependent, which the greatest terrible thing about that is they live in tyranny because somebody took away their hope and their idea that they could succeed and they can grow and they can have more and they can do better is because we've annulled that with government programs that haven't been effective at all.
Well, you sat in that august body known as the United States Senate for 10 years, and I have to say that very recently senators whom I have respected over the years, like John McCain, have done a great disservice, I think, in undermining what the president is trying to do and in saying things that are just shocking to me. I wonder how it is that just a few months into a new presidency, senators and congressmen cannot understand that we've got to all work together to make some things happen. I mean, I'm just stunned at the division within the GOP at this point. It's I would never accuse most of them of having spines, but I thought that they might have a spine for 6 or 8 months.
Well, I think it describes perfectly the situation we find ourselves in Washington. We have very short-term thinkers that are thinking about the next election much more so than the next generation. There is political expediency with every statement that comes out, or almost every statement. There's very few true statesmen in the Senate or stateswomen. And so what we see is an all-me, but no sacrificial leadership, which says I give up my position if, in fact, I do the right thing.
See, that's the key right there. What you just said is the key right there. Why do you have the position? If you are a senator or a congressman or whatever you are, you have that position to do the right thing. And if you do the right thing and you sacrifice something of yourself or of your power, typically history will reward you. And if history doesn't reward you, God will reward you, because that's why you were there. If we had a handful of people willing to do that, we'd get someplace. Right now, clearly, we don't. I'm concerned for the Republic. We're going to be right back. I'm talking right now to former Senator, Tom Coburn. The book is Smashing the D.C. Monopoly. Stick around. Hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. I am talking to former Senator Tom Coburn. He has a brand new book out. I love the title, Smashing the D.C. Monopoly. There's an endorsement right on the cover from Mark Levin, who I believe cares about the Constitution. He says, we the people can limit the spending, limit the regulation, and limit the time in office. Smashing the D.C. monopoly is essential for any politician who loves liberty and for all of us who want to hold our representatives accountable. That's what it's all about, Senator Coburn. We, the people, we are the government, and it is our job to hold our representatives accountable. If we don't do that, we really cannot. We can't blame them because we're the ones who elect them.
Yes, but we also can look at what our founders thought and intended with the Constitution they set up and how it's been distorted through the courts. Remember, our founders wanted this balance between the state and the federal government.
Right.
And they actually trusted state legislators to make most of the decisions. The federal government was to be limited, powerful when it comes to defense and raising an army and defending the country, but limited in every other aspect. Everything that wasn't spelled out was reserved for the states. Well, we no longer have that. The design of our country is now fallen way outside of that. And our founders knew that. When they met, George Mason talked about, do you ever know of any government in history that's voluntarily ceded power back to its people? And the fact is there wasn't any. So they put Article 5, the state's portion of our Article 5, in there.
Now, most Americans, I just want to say, most Americans, and I'm among them until recently, know nothing about Article 5. It's never been mentioned. It's just not the sort of thing. When I heard about this from Jenna Ellis, who's a law professor at Colorado Christian University, my jaw dropped. I said, you mean to tell me that the genius founders put this kind of poison pill in the Constitution, so if things got bad enough, there was a way to deal with it, and I'd never heard of it before, and that's what you're talking about with Article 5.
Absolutely. And that was the first part of Article 5. Actually, the part that allowed the Congress to offer amendments was added later in their discussions. They thought, well, if we haven't done this right, we ought to give the Congress ability to maybe attract more power for themselves. But they put Article 5 in for the states so that they could lessen the power given to the federal government or limit its power.
Okay, and how does Article 5 of the Constitution do that?
Well, here's how it works. What it says is that if 2/3 of the states call for an amendments convention, then each state will go as a state and attend such amendments convention. That requires 34 states. The Congress has to call it if, in fact, those 34 states meet that requirement. And what comes out of that is the product of whatever the application was for the amendments convention. So, for example, what we're proposing that 12 states have already passed is a financial responsibility amendments saying you got to have a balanced budget, you actually have to live within your means, and you have to use generally accepted accounting principles.
That's shocking.
Yeah, the same thing all the rest of us have to do when we comply with the IRS. Yeah. The federal government ought to have to do that.
Right.
The second thing is to limit the scope and jurisdiction of the federal government because the scope has been so expanded by the courts. If you go and look at most states, 60% of the money that they tax their own citizens inside their state is controlled by a federal bureaucrat in Washington. So, for example, in education, most of the money for education is raised locally. But the Federal Department of Education tells you how you must allocate it, how you must spend it.
I just want to ask, how the heck did this ever happen? Because anybody who understands the fundamental principles of America understands that, government's supposed to be in loco parentis. We get together in our neighborhood and we say, you know what, we don't have time to educate our kids, so we're going to hire a school master or a school marm, and they're going to take care of it, and they're going to teach the kids what we want them to teach the kids. Now, we know they've got ideas of their own, but they're hired by us.
Right.
That's basically public education, that people have the right to determine that kind of stuff.
Used to be.
And something happened, and the federal government took control. When did that happen?
It happened in 1976, but it also happened when Thomas Jefferson was asked whether the federal government ought to be involved in education, really the father of education of our country. And he said, for that to happen, you'd have to have an amendment to the Constitution. So here's Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, when asked about the federal government involvement in education, said, absolutely not. This was reserved for the states and the local communities, and then we had land grant colleges, and then we had this, and then we had the Department of Education, and in fact, since 1976, we as Americans have spent $3.7 trillion through Washington back, and there's not one parameter that's better in education, and many that are worse.
Well, but isn't that always the case? I mean, isn't that like a rule that when the government gets involved? I'm not just trying to be funny, that the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson, the more money you throw at problems via the federal government, the less effect it seems to have. You just throw money, and it seems to do nothing. This seems to be provable at this point, and you're telling me that it's happened with regard to education.
Sure, and you know Marvin Olasky wrote a great book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, which outlines how America for the first 180 years took care of things. Actually, the other side of that is a case called Coburn, where a guy in Ohio raised wheat outside his allotment. And so then the Supreme Court ultimately decided, because he didn't buy the 18 acres worth of wheat in interstate commerce, that what he raised inside of Ohio that never was sold, and it was all used for his own chickens, his own family, and to replant seed, was interstate commerce. So we had this expansion of the Commerce Clause that now is the authority for all these government agencies to tell states what to do. So getting back to the main point, we actually can fix this. We as citizens, all we have to do is call our state legislators and say we want to make an application to restore the balance of power, to return it to where we actually have some influence on it. You know, for almost 4 million people, I was a U.S. Senator for 10 years. Not very many of them could talk to me. Not very many of them could get in to see me. Our founders wanted that representative government here. They wanted most of the decisions to be made where most of the decisions had an affect and an effect on individual citizens. And so we've lost that as the federal government has assumed and subsumed much of the authority of the states.
It's an extraordinary thing because the principles. I had Richard Dreyfuss on this program recently, and we'll have him back. But he's somebody who's politically liberal, but he gets all this stuff. He understands that if you don't teach civics to kids, if you don't teach the Constitution to kids, it's game over. And I've been, shouting that for a couple of years here, that this is absolutely vital, because if you don't even understand the concept of states' rights and how the states are supposed to function, and then you're just going to shrug. You're not going to understand it. I wonder today how many Americans get this idea that the founders wanted this to be the United States of America. This is not just a federal government. It's United States. They're united, but they're individual states. They have their own rights, their own rules, their own laws, and it's an extraordinary thing that we've just kind of lost sight of that.
Yeah, I agree. In healthcare, they're talking about, well, maybe we ought to have a tort law at the federal level on malpractice. Well, once you let the nose of the camel under the tent and on torts, you want the federal government now deciding all tort. This is all fixable. Actually, some interesting statistics from Pew Research. 69% of millennials don't trust the federal government, but 56% want more of it. All right. So what that is that's schizophrenia, because they have no knowledge. 4 to 8% is the number of millennials that know the three branches of the federal government, somewhere between 4 and 8. That means 90%.
Did you say what I thought you just said? 4 to 8% of millennials
know
the three branches of federal government.
90% don't.
That you might as well declare America dead. If you have that kind of a population unaware of the most basic concept of who we are as a country, that's a grand tragedy. That is frightening to me.
Well, and again, this is all republics have died, Eric. And they've died over the same thing.
Yeah.
They've died over debt, but they've also died over growing government and less freedom.
But we've never had a republic like the United States of America. I would say that we've been called by God to spread liberty around the world, to spread self-government around the world. We're going to be right back, folks, to talk more about America, the United States of America in particular. The new book is Smashing the D.C. Monopoly, Using Article 5 to Restore Freedom and Stop Runaway Government by Senator Tom Coburn. We'll be right back. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Hey there, folks. It's the Eric Metaxas Show. Little Johnny Cash. I'm talking to a former senator from Oklahoma, Tom Coburn. He's got a great book out called Smashing the D.C. Monopoly. The question is, how do we smash this nefarious anti-American, anti-liberty thing called the D.C. monopoly? You say to do it with Article 5 in the Constitution. Most Americans don't know anything about that.
Well, first of all, that's the real question. is who decides. You know, if you ask somebody in Berkeley, California, should a bureaucrat in Washington decide or should you decide? They'll say, I should decide. If you ask a conservative in Texas, who should decide? Should I decide or should a regulator in Washington decide? So it's pretty much a bipartisan deal is we've lost the ability to make decisions for ourselves, and now we're told by an elitist group and a fourth branch of government how and what and when and where we will live, do, spit, sing, whatever. And so the idea is to restore the original principles by limiting the Commerce Clause, limiting the bureaucracy. And we do that through using Article 5, which says if you have 2/3 of the states request an amendments convention, you can do that.
Okay, I just want to be clear. So, folks, what we're talking about is this thing called a convention of the states.
Yeah, it's not a constitutional convention.
No, not a constitutional convention, so we shouldn't get scared, but it's a convention of the states. We've never had one before.
No, but they were really common before the constitutional convention, both in states and regions. Actually, if you look at how the constitutional convention came about, it came out of the Annapolis Convention, a call for the constitutional convention.
I didn't know that.
So this was really common. Matter of fact, there was movements in terms of calling for a convention before the Bill of Rights was passed. That started, 2 states started that, and then Madison said, I'm going to write some 21 amendments and give them to the guys in Congress, and let's see. And all of a sudden, Congress passed 10 amendments, and that kind of calmed everything down. And so this imbalance that was perceived originally in the original Constitution was solved using the format, but not actually by calling it a convention.
You're going back, 240 years. Now, the thing is that since then, we've never had a convention of the states. So most people, when you talk about a convention of the states, they just say, what is that?
That's right. It's our ability. It is the safety valve in our Constitution to make sure that we don't have a runaway federal government that ultimately takes away our liberty and gives us tyranny.
Okay, so we have 12 states thus far who've signed up for this?
Yes.
And we need 34.
That's right.
And what do you think it's going to take to get the remaining?
It's going to take millions of people calling their state legislators, their assemblyman or their state senator, and saying, I want us to do this. I want us to have a balanced budget with generally accepted accounting principles. I want to limit the reach and scope of the federal government. I want to give back more decision-making to my local state legislator. And I do want term limits on both appointed and elected federal officials. We had that. The Supreme Court said we couldn't do it, and 26 states actually had limits on their terms for their members of Congress. But the Supreme Court in the Arkansas case said you can't do that. Well, that was another 5-4 decision where the Supreme Court decided that we couldn't limit the terms of our members of Congress. And when you poll that's an 84% issue. Both parties want us to be able to limit because they know the seductive power of power and the poor judgment that comes along with that.
But how extraordinary that you could have 5 Supreme Court justices who don't get that. That's that's what scares me, is that you have Supreme Court justices who no longer understand the vision of the founders for this country.
Well, think about health care. What the FTC says today, the most efficient hospitals in the country with the best outcomes are the physician-owned hospitals. The Affordable Care Act made it illegal for a doctor to own a hospital.
You are kidding. See, I don't know anything about this.
And so that was appealed, and the Supreme Court wouldn't hear it, and they lost it at the appellate. Now, think about this. Hospitals can own doctors, but doctors can't own hospitals. What happened? What part of freedom do we not understand? And so what we had, and that was all a favor to the big hospitals who didn't want competition.
Oh, my gosh.
And that they had the lobbying force to get that in the Affordable Care Act.
That is so wicked. I mean, it is wicked. My dad's been in the hospital a bunch lately. He'll be 90 in June, and I have to say that most Americans understand when you go to a hospital, you think this doesn't really seem like it's run in a way to get people better. It almost seems like a bureaucracy. They're taking your blood or your pulse or whatever every 15 minutes. They don't let you sleep. Any fool, any idiot knows that sleep is what heals people, and you want people to be comfortable and so on and so forth. And so again, when you talk about big hospitals having big lobbying arms, that is so fundamentally un-American. I just call it wicked. How would a convention of states deal with that issue?
Well, that's an issue where you could actually say that we're going to have freedom, and so we're going to limit the Commerce Clause ability to tell hospitals in Oklahoma whether or not they can be owned by a doctor.
Hallelujah. Folks, this is great stuff. I'm talking former Senator Tom Coburn. We'll be right back. It's the Eric Metaxas Show, a little Freebird for you. I'm talking to former Senator Tom Coburn. He's in the studio with me. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
It's
Pleasure
just a joy to talk to somebody who understands these things and who cares and is doing something about it. And so is your biggest effort now, because you left the Senate in the beginning of 2015, is the big effort now for you to push for this convention of the states? Is this what you're working on?
You bet. And the reason I wrote this book is to get the average American to understand they actually can make a difference.
Yeah.
And that everybody's frustrated in the country. Donald Trump's a result of frustration, right?
No question.
So the question is if he and the Republicans can't fix what's wrong, we can. And here's our founders that give us a way to do it.
Yeah.
And so if, in fact, we get 20 million people involved in this, we got 2.8 million involved now, we get another 16, 17 million talking to their legislator, this is going to happen. And you know what? Whatever comes out of there is just a recommendation, and then the states get to decide. Should we balance our budget and live within our means? Should we not jeopardize the future for our grandkids? Should we do what's best for the country in the long term rather than what's politically expedient today? That's what people want to have done. They want to trust the federal government. Not long ago, there was a poll out that 84% of the people in this country don't trust the federal government. That's a disaster waiting to happen.
Yeah. Well, it's again, and the media plays a big role in this. I don't want to get into that, but that's that's part of the problem. In a sense, big federal government is kind of like big media or big corporations. The founders didn't really foresee that we could have gigantic corporations doing what they're doing now, almost setting policy because they have so much money and so much power. It's a scary thing, and the founders didn't think about that. The founders also didn't think about having TV and internet where a few cultural elites who are coming from the same worldview and usually from the same zip codes, they have a way of thinking, and they have the bully pulpit, 90% of the time. They're talking and talking. So they're making it. They get to really harm the way we have our national conversation. They probably think I'm sure they think that they're doing good. But this idea of the Convention of the States, this is. I was someplace, I think it was in Texas, and there were a bunch of state legislators that came into the room. And some of them were wearing cowboy boots. You're supposed to be dressed up. Some of them weren't all that dressed up. You realize these folks are from rural parts of the state. Yeah. And I looked up at these state legislators and I thought, this is America. These people are they're citizens who have decided, I'm going to be a state senator, I'm going to be whatever. But they're not big politicians. They're not big senators walking around with staff. This is America. The states and the legislatures of these states. It's a beautiful thing. It reminds me of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. This idea that we're really accountable, and that the distance between where the decision gets made and the people that it affects is not so big. I mean, that's true in every way, but it just moved me to see it.
Yeah, the original intent was that in fact we would see statesman-like leadership, and it would be based on principles, not expediency. One of Martin Luther King's, I've kind of transformed one of the things he said. He said, vanity asks the question, is it popular? And cowardice asks the question, is it expedient? But character asks the question, is it right? And so what we're seeing today isn't right. It isn't right for freedom. It isn't right for economic freedom. It isn't right for elevating the whole society in terms of their economic wealth. Nothing's working the way it should work because the government's in the way of so much of it. So we can solve that. You got to have a joint resolution that comes out of both houses, except in Nebraska where they have a unicameral. And when you get to 34 of those, then the Congress has to call a convention. The convention decides within the parameters of what we've asked for what amendments they think ought to be offered. Those go to the states. They're just recommendations, and then it requires 38 states. And the reason to build a grassroots army for this is, one, is to make sure whatever gets through there gets passed and we actually do get a balanced budget. We do limit the federal government, and we do put term limits on. But also to make sure that Americans know from now on we're going to keep our power. We're going to keep our freedom. We're going to keep our liberty. And there's a difference between those two. One is freedom to actually be and move. The other is liberty of mind. Because what happens is a large federal government smothers the desire for liberty. When you build dependency, you smother the desire for liberty.
Absolutely. I mean, this is at the very heart of everything. I mean, I have to say, it's just music to my ears to hear you talk and to know that you exist, because, you know, there are not many statesmen out there, unfortunately, and I think that what you're doing is statesmanlike. It's necessary. It will benefit millions who'll never know your name, but this is the right thing, and you've got the ability to draw attention to it. You've, of course, written a book about it. Folks, in case you're wondering, the book is called Smashing the D.C. Monopoly. I am talking to former Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn about a great idea. It is called Preserving Liberty and Self-Government in Our Generation. Senator Coburn, again, it's just a joy to know you're out there working on this.
I've been in 25 states in the last 2 years.
Wow.
It's really interesting to see America at the legislative level. And all these wonderful people that are trying to do the right thing for their state and are inhibited by the federal government through a soft tyranny.
That's what it is.
Yeah, it's a soft tyranny for sure. And they're frustrated because if they want to get some of their money back, it comes with all these strings attached that make no common sense, make no practical sense. And yet, if they want to use some of their money, they have to follow what an unelected bureaucrat in Washington has
Think
told
of the
them.
irony, the screaming irony that we fought for independence from tyranny, and that all these years later we have crept and crept and crept back to, as you put it, a soft tyranny. That's simply what it is. The idea that we can get out of it, but it won't be easy. What I've said is that we're in an existential crisis like the Civil War and like the Revolution, where if we don't fight, we will lose everything we have. And so you're one of the fighters.
And we have to fight peacefully. Here's a way to prevent anarchy using Article 5, because there will come a time when people will reject the federal government's interference in their daily lives. And, you know, there's been books out there, just mass noncompliance with the law. I mean, that's suggested. We, the people, just don't follow it. They can't put us all in jail. Well, let's fix it the right way. And let's fix it by amending the Constitution and restoring the balance of power, not only between the states and the federal government, but also between the states and between the three branches of the federal government. You know, one of the proposals that people have talked about is if the Supreme Court makes a stupid decision, why couldn't 30 states say, we disagree with that? And if you reach 30 states saying, well, no, it doesn't count. Actually, we don't think that's right.
Yeah,
it's the vast 60% of the states say, no, that's not right. Now, that's some of the ideas that have been put forward in terms of limiting the scope and jurisdiction. And it's not to say that the Supreme Court gets it wrong. A lot of times they get it right. But a lot of times they've made decisions, for example, for the unborn. No?
Well, it's a scandal that they've overreached. It's the judicial branch has begun to be something other than the judicial branch. They are now legislating from the bench. And we know that that's fundamentally un-American, fundamentally against the Constitution. The fact that they've been able to get away with it, that's the scandal.
Well, here's another fact that your listeners may be interested in. The average length of service of a federal judge the first 150 years of our country was 6 years, not 30.
Wow.
And so, first of all, we didn't elevate their pay, so they didn't stay there. They went back and practiced.
Yeah.
And number two is they were honorable in terms of I've done this, I've done my service, so I'm going to go do something else. Now we see it as a career. You become a federal judge, and you're there forever.
That's the idea. Cincinnatus and his plow, another reason not to have voted for Hillary Clinton, because if ever there was a career politician, she was one, and it just isn't good no matter which side they're on. Senator Tom Coburn, just a joy to have this time with you. Thanks for being my guest.
Thank you for having me.
Sign the petition at cosaction.com and get as many of your friends and family to do the same. With your full address, your state legislators will know that you really are their constituents in their district. Our success depends on you, so we're inviting you to be part of history. Let's invoke the constitutional solution that's as big as the problem.